You stand on the windswept plains of East Africa in the year 1889, watching as a blind old man sits cross-legged beneath a thorny acacia tree. His weathered hands grip a carved wooden staff, and his clouded eyes stare into a distance only he can see. The warriors around him whisper his name with both reverence and fear. Mbatian, the great Libon, the most powerful spiritual leader the Maasai have ever known. But this man who could predict the future, who commanded the respect of thousands of warriors, who united warring tribes with his visions, carried a secret so dark it would tear his people apart for generations. A secret that began not with his enemies, but with his own sons, and a deception so cruel it still divides the Maasai today. Before we dive into this forgotten tale of betrayal and prophecy, if you find these hidden stories of African history fascinating, hit that like button and subscribe for more untold stories from across the continent. And please comment below to let me know where you're watching from. I love connecting with fellow history lovers from around the world. The story of Mbatian begins in 1840, when he was born into the most sacred bloodline among the Maasai people. His father, Supit, was already a feared Libon, one of the spiritual leaders who combined the roles of prophet, healer, and military advisor. But even as a child, Mbatian showed powers that surpassed his father's gifts. The young boy would wake from dreams speaking of the events that would happen weeks later. He could sense when cattle raiders were approaching before any scouts returned with news. Most remarkably, he seemed to hear the voices of ancestors who guided him toward decisions that always proved correct. The elders watched him with a mixture of awe and unease, recognizing that they were witnessing the emergence of a spiritual force unlike any they had seen. Some probably wondered if they should have paid more attention to his mother's diet during pregnancy. When Mbatian inherited his father's position in 1866, the Maasai were facing their greatest crisis in generations. Different sections of the tribe were locked in bitter warfare, fighting over cattle and grazing lands. The once mighty Maasai nation was tearing itself apart, weakened and vulnerable to their enemies. It was into this chaos that the 26-year-old Mbatian stepped, carrying powers that would make him the most feared man on the East African plains. His first act as Libon demonstrated the terrifying accuracy of his prophetic gifts. The Purko Kizongo section of the Maasai was preparing to face their northern neighbours, the Ilaikipiak, in what everyone expected to be a devastating battle. The Ilaikipiak were known as fierce warriors who had never been defeated. But Mbatian called for the warriors to gather, and under the star-filled African sky, he shared a vision that left them speechless. He told them exactly where the enemy would attack, at what hour, and from which direction. More incredibly, he described how the battle would unfold, predicting that the Ilaikipiak would be not just defeated, but completely destroyed as a people. His vision was so detailed that some warriors wondered if he had been secretly attending the enemy's war councils, though nobody was brave enough to ask. When the battle came, everything happened exactly as Mbatian had foretold. The Ilaikipiak were crushed so completely that they ceased to exist as a distinct group. Word of this impossible victory spread across the plains like wildfire. Here was a Libon whose powers went beyond anything their ancestors had known. The surviving Ilaikipiak, who escaped the massacre, spoke in hushed tones about the Maasai prophet, who could see through time itself. This victory marked the beginning of Mbatian's rise to absolute power. One by one, the feuding Maasai sections came to him, seeking his guidance and protection. His fame spread beyond the Maasai to other tribes, who began sending gifts and tribute to avoid his wrath. Even Arab slave traders and ivory merchants learned to respect the prophet, whose warriors could strike with perfect timing, always knowing exactly when and where their enemies were vulnerable. But Mbatian's most chilling prophecies were yet to come. In the late 1880s, as he entered his final years, the old Libon began speaking of visions that terrified even his most loyal followers. He spoke of pale-skinned strangers who would come from across the great waters, men who would bring with them weapons that could kill from great distances, and diseases that would devastate the land. Most famously, he he prophesied the coming of what he called the Iron Snake, a great metal serpent that would cut through Maasai land, splitting the territory in two and bringing with it the end of the traditional way of life. The warriors laughed at first. How could a metal snake move across the land? Clearly their prophets had been spending too much time staring at the sun. But Mbatian's previous predictions had all proven true, and slowly, a chill of fear began to settle over his followers. As Mbatian's health began to fail in 1889, these prophecies took on an urgent tone. The old prophet knew his time was running short, and he began to prepare for the most important decision of his life, choosing his successor. This choice would determine not just the future of his family, but the fate of the entire Maasai nation. Mbatian had two sons by his different wives. The elder was Sento, a warrior of exceptional skill and courage, who had proven himself in countless battles. Sento was everything a Maasai leader should be: tall, strong, fearless in combat, and respected by the warriors. He was the obvious choice to inherit his father's position, and everyone in the tribe expected him to become the next Laibon. Sento himself was so confident in his inheritance that he'd probably already started practicing his victory speeches. The younger son was Olonana, known to the British as Lenana. Unlike his brother, Lenana was not particularly distinguished as a warrior. He was smaller in stature, more thoughtful than fierce, and seemed to prefer negotiation to combat. While Sento commanded respect through strength and courage, Lenana possessed a different kind of intelligence, a cunning mind that could see opportunities others missed. If this were a modern family business, Sento would be the operations manager, while Lenana would be the one reading the fine print in contracts. The relationship between the two brothers had always been complicated. Sento, secure in his position as the favoured heir, treated his younger brother with a mixture of affection and condescension. Lenana, for his part, appeared to accept this arrangement, always deferring to his older brother in public and showing him the respect due to the future leader. But beneath Lenana's humble exterior, a different plan was taking shape. As 1890 dawned, Mbatian's condition worsened rapidly. The great prophet, who had once stood tall and proud, was now a frail old man. His sight nearly gone, his once powerful voice reduced to a whisper. The entire tribe held its breath, waiting for him to name his successor. The tradition was clear. Whichever son Mbatian called to his deathbed would inherit not just his position, but the sacred items that symbolised the Laibon's spiritual authority. It was during this critical period that Lenana made his move. He had noticed that his father's failing eyesight and advancing age had begun to affect his judgment. The old man sometimes confused names and faces, living more in his visions than in the present world. Lenana realised that this confusion might provide the opportunity he needed. Sento, confident in his position as the chosen heir, had left the homestead on a cattle raid, a final military expedition, before assuming the responsibilities of leadership. It was a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life, because it gave Lenana the chance he had been waiting for. Perhaps Sento should have paid more attention to his brother's sudden interest in helping with their father's care. On the day Mbatian was expected to die, as the old prophet lay on his cowhide bed surrounded by the elders of the tribe, he called out in a weak voice for his chosen son to approach. The tradition was that the dying Laibon would place his hands on his successor's head and transfer his spiritual authority, along with the sacred objects that had been passed down through generations of leaders. This was the moment when Lenana committed the act that his brother's descendants still call the greatest betrayal in Maasai history. Instead of sending word for Sento to return, instead of waiting for the rightful heir, Lenana stepped forward and knelt beside his dying father. In his weakened state, with his vision nearly gone, Mbatian mistook his younger son for his chosen successor. The old prophet placed his trembling hands on Lenana's head and spoke the sacred words that would transfer his authority. More importantly, he gave Lenana the ritual objects that symbolised the Laibon's power. The sacred stones used for divination, the ceremonial staff, and other items that were considered essential for legitimate leadership. These objects, passed down through generations, were seen as containing the spiritual power necessary to guide the tribe. When Sento returned from his raid to find his father dead and his brother proclaimed as the new Libon, his rage was terrible to behold. He accused Lenana of trickery and theft, claiming that their father had been confused and deceived in his final moments. But the elders who had witnessed the ceremony were bound by tradition to recognise the man who had received Mbatian's blessing, regardless of the circumstances. It was like arriving at a party to find someone else had already blown out your birthday candles, except the stakes were the future of an entire nation. The confrontation between the brothers that followed revealed the depth of the division Lenana's deception had created. Sentu, supported by many of the traditional warriors who saw him as the rightful leader, refused to accept his brother's authority. Lenana, now in possession of the sacred objects and the formal recognition of the elders, defended his actions as fulfilling his father's true wishes. The split that followed was unlike anything the Maasai had experienced since Mbatian first united them. The tribe divided into two factions, those who supported Lenana as the legitimately chosen Libon, and those who followed Sento as the rightful heir. This division was not just political, but spiritual, as each brother claimed to carry their father's true legacy. The timing of this succession dispute could not have been worse for the Maasai people. Even as the brothers fought for control, the prophecies Mbatian had made were beginning to come true. European explorers and missionaries were appearing on the edges of Maasai territory, and reports were coming in of a massive construction project that sounded suspiciously like the Iron Snake the old prophet had foretold. The Uganda Railway, built by the British to connect the coast to the interior of East Africa, was indeed cutting through traditional Maasai lands, just as Mbatian had predicted. The sight of the iron rails stretching across the plains and the smoke-belching locomotives that travelled on them convinced many Maasai that their old prophet's most incredible visions were coming to pass. Suddenly nobody was laughing about metal serpents anymore. But instead of uniting to face this external threat, the tribe remained divided by the dispute between the brothers. Lenana, recognising that the old ways of resistance might no longer work against enemies with such powerful technology, began to consider the possibility of negotiating with these European newcomers. Sento, true to traditional Maasai values, advocated for armed resistance regardless of the odds. Lenana made a choice that would forever mark him as either a pragmatic saviour or a collaborating traitor, depending on who told the story. As British colonial officials began establishing their authority in the region, he opened negotiations with them, offering cooperation in exchange for recognition of his leadership and protection of Maasai interests. The British, who had been expecting fierce resistance from the famously warlike Maasai, were surprised and pleased to find a leader willing to work with them. They had heard stories of Maasai military prowess and had feared that controlling their territory would require lengthy and costly warfare. Lenana's willingness to negotiate seemed to offer a much easier path to establishing British control. It was like finding out the school bully wanted to be friends instead of fighting. In 1898, the British colonial administration appointed Lenana as paramount chief of the Maasai, giving him official recognition and resources to maintain order among his people. This appointment was seen by Lenana's supporters as validation of his leadership and proof that his diplomatic approach was working. But to Sento's followers, it was the final confirmation that Lenana had betrayed his people to foreign invaders. Sento, meanwhile, refused to accept his brother's authority or the British appointment that legitimised it. He gathered his most loyal followers and led them away from the main Maasai territories, seeking to establish an independent stronghold where traditional ways could be preserved. This exodus fulfilled another of Mbatian's prophecies, as those who abandoned their ancestral lands faced exactly the disasters the old prophet had predicted. Disease ravaged Sento's followers, their cattle died in large numbers, and they found themselves in conflict with German colonial forces who controlled the territory where they had sought refuge. The proud warriors who had followed Sento in the hope of maintaining their independence were reduced to struggling for basic survival. By 1902, the failure of armed resistance had become clear even to Sento. His followers were decimated, his cattle were gone, and the German authorities were treating him as a fugitive. Swallowing his pride, he sent messengers to his brother asking for permission to return to Maasai territory and rejoin the tribe under Lenana's leadership. Lenana's response revealed both his political sophistication and the lasting bitterness of their dispute. He agreed to allow Sento to return, but only on the condition that his brother publicly acknowledged Lenana's legitimate authority and renounce any claims to leadership. It was a humiliation that Sento had no choice but to accept. The public ceremony at which Sento submitted to his brother's authority was one of the most painful moments in Maasai oral history. The once proud warrior, reduced by defeat and desperation, had to kneel before the brother he believed had stolen his birthright and beg for permission to live among his own people. It was a moment that would echo through generations, a reminder of how quickly pride can be broken by circumstances beyond anyone's control. But even this apparent victory for Lenana could not resolve the fundamental contradictions in his position. As the years passed, it became increasingly clear that his cooperation with the British had not protected Maasai interests as he had hoped. Colonial policies gradually reduced Maasai territories, restricted their traditional practices, and imposed new forms of control that were impossible to resist through negotiation alone. The iron snake that Mbatian had prophesied brought not just the railway, but an endless stream of European settlers who claimed more and more Maasai land. The diseases the old prophet had warned about devastated both human and animal populations. Most painfully, the social cohesion that had been the source of Maasai strength was shattered by the continuing division between those who supported Lenana's accommodation with colonial rule and those who believed it represented a fundamental betrayal. Lenana himself began to show signs of the spiritual torment that comes from making impossible choices. As he aged, he became increasingly isolated, trusted fully by neither his own people nor his British partners. The sacred objects he had inherited from his father seemed to offer him no guidance for problems they had never been designed to solve. The prophet, who had united the Maasai through the power of his visions and the fear he inspired in his enemies, had left behind sons who could only divide their people. The dark secret of Lenana's deception had created a wound in the heart of Maasai society that would never fully heal. Even today, more than a century later, the descendants of the two brothers maintain separate traditions and tell different versions of their family story. Some Maasai families trace their lineage to Sento and preserve stories of his courage and integrity, viewing him as the rightful heir who was cheated of his inheritance. Other families claim descent from Lenana's supporters and maintain that he was a visionary leader who made the difficult choices necessary to ensure Maasai survival. The historical record offers evidence to support both interpretations, which is perhaps why the division has proved so lasting. Lenana's negotiations with the British did indeed prevent the kind of military campaigns that devastated other African peoples during the colonial period. But the cost of this survival was enormous. The unity that Mbatian had forged through his spiritual authority was permanently shattered. Today, as the Maasai face new challenges from climate change, economic pressures, and continued encroachment on their traditional lands, the lessons of Mbatian's legacy remain painfully relevant. The choice between adaptation and resistance, between pragmatic compromise and principled opposition, continues to divide communities and families. The story of Mbatian and his sons reminds us that even the most powerful spiritual leaders cannot protect their people from the consequences of their own human weaknesses. The prophet, who could see across time and predict the fate of nations, could not prevent his own family from tearing itself apart. The man who united warring tribes through the force of his personality left behind a legacy of division that no amount of spiritual authority could heal. In the end, the most feared Maasai leader in history was defeated not by his enemies or by the colonial forces he had predicted, but by the inability of his own sons to honour the values he had tried to instill in them. the dark secret that still divides the tribe is not just the story of one brother's betrayal of another, but a warning about how quickly unity can be destroyed when personal ambition takes precedence over collective welfare. The winds that blow across the East African plains today carry whispers of this ancient dispute, reminding the Maasai that their greatest enemy has never been drought or disease or foreign invasion, but the human capacity for betraying those we should protect. Perhaps that is the most important prophecy of all, that the greatest threats to any people come not from outside forces, no matter how powerful, but from the failures of character and wisdom within their own communities.